Hello, and welcome to A Postdoc's Journal, the show that takes you through my journey into and eventually out of academia as a postdoctoral research scientist. My name is Simit Patel. Hello, thank you very much for joining me. Welcome back to those of you who may have listened to the show before, and a very warm welcome to those of you who may be listening for the very first time. If you don't already know, this podcast is based on my own personal private journal. In each episode, I read out a journal entry from about 11 or 12 years ago, back when I was working in academia as a postdoc, as a research scientist. Then I reflect on it, I analyze it, I try to make sense of it, and share my thoughts with you today with the benefit of hindsight. If you are someone who can relate to things like imposter syndrome, loneliness, and just mental health issues in the workplace, whether you're in academia or not, I hope that by sharing my own personal experience with you, it helps you to feel a little bit less alone. In today's episode, we jump to a couple of days after the last journal entry in the previous episode. So that's episode 4, 5, and 6 of this season were all written in the same week of each other. I guess I had a lot on my mind that week. This journal entry is about making decisions about my future in academia. I was coming up to the end of the 5-month extension I was given on my contract with a semi-confident promise on me getting a 6-month extension after that. This episode is really about trying to figure out what you truly want. It sounds simple, and in some ways, it is very simple to know what you want. What can complicate things is when what you want is incompatible with the demands of the environment around you. Before I read out the journal entry, if you've listened to the show before and you've liked it and you found it interesting, I would really appreciate it if you could take just 1 minute of your time to leave a review or some stars or hearts or thumbs or whatever you use to show your appreciation wherever you are listening to this. If you normally subscribe and follow things, please subscribe and follow this podcast too. I've also started a Reddit channel where you can join the conversation. Links to everything are in the show notes. So have a listen to the reading now, and I'll be back at the end to share some thoughts with you after a decade or so of hindsight. Enjoy. June 17th, 2014. Decision time. My boss mentioned to me yesterday that we need to start talking and planning my future now. In short, if I want to stay working in this group, I have to bring in my own funding. My boss seems to be very, very happy for me to stick around. But I can't stand still. He says I have to progress, I have to move up the ladder. There are 2 big questions here. 1, do I want to stay in Frankfurt and in this lab, go back to the UK, or somewhere else entirely? And 2, what science or project do I actually want to work on? When I sit down to think about the answers to these questions, I can't help but think of a third question. Do I want a career change? I suppose the common theme here is about what I want. Not what I need, not what's right, but what I actually want. I also can't think of one of these questions without considering the other ones at the same time. Staying in Frankfurt but working on one thing is a totally different situation to staying in Frankfurt and working on another thing. It feels like a very complex problem to solve, and I can't wrap my head around it. I want to map out and draw the whole problem and look at it in 3D. Moving back to the UK feels like starting again. Not wanting to go back to the UK feels a bit like I'm running away from having to make a long-term decision about my future. By staying abroad, it feels like I'm putting off making that decision for a while. I have no reason to go back. I have no life to go back to there. The prospect of having to go to another country doesn't appeal to me either. I'm not sure I want to start from square one, again, not when I've invested so much in setting myself up here. I think staying in Frankfurt is the best option for me right now. The prospect of staying is the only option that doesn't make me feel uncomfortable, unhappy, or unduly stressed. Fine, decision made. I want to stay. So if I want to stay, I need to bring in funding. My boss suggested the new Rapid Evolution DFG grants. This brings me to question 2. What do I actually want to be working on? I've never been very good at coming up with my own research ideas. Ever since I started out doing research, I've always just taken on research ideas from other people, and I just get on with it. I've never really come up with my own idea myself and brought it to life. At earlier stages in my career, this was an advantage. Not being too fussy about which organism I work with or what techniques I work with, it enabled me to go anywhere, do anything, and be content with whatever I ended up working on, more or less. But now my lack of innovation is a real problem. I'm just not an innovator, I guess. I had assumed and hoped that my own research ideas would just naturally emerge over time, particularly during my postdoc. But it seems to not have actually happened. My mind just doesn't seem to work that way. I don't have what it takes. I don't have the research ideas. That's what one needs to progress and move up the ladder. Plus, my poor publication record and academic record means that I haven't positioned myself very well to get any grants or anything. Okay, thank you very much for listening to that. As usual, I've written down some thoughts after reading that back and hearing that back. When I was reflecting on this journal entry, what stood out to me the most was the importance of listening to your intuition. This journal entry was really all about that feeling that you get in your body, particularly in your gut, when it comes to making big decisions. So I wanted to reflect a little on how sometimes your gut tells you one thing, but it might be incompatible with the demands of the world around you. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the choice I made to stay living abroad as an expat in Germany. And I wanted to talk about the realization I had about my strengths and weaknesses around coming up with new research ideas. And I also want to talk a little bit about how I wish things might have been different back then, particularly when I was at this stage in academia. Before we get into the reflection, I want to ask you a quick question. Do you ever worry about your paper being rejected because the English isn't good enough? One thing I've always been good at is writing, but I know not everyone finds that easy. Perhaps English isn't your first language, or for some reason, the words you write just don't quite capture what you want to say. Good English can enhance your scientific credibility, increase the chance of your article being accepted, and speed up the peer review process. Whether you're a research scientist, a scientific writer, or part of a dynamic biotech company, I want to help you with my professional copy editing and proofreading services for scientific English. Enhancing the clarity and precision of writing has been an integral part of my professional life in academia and in the biotech industry for over a decade. If you need a native English speaker with a solid scientific background and a professional certification in proofreading to refine and polish your writing, I would love to help you. Please visit simitpatel.com, that's simitpatel.com for more information. Thank you, and now back to the show. The first point I wanted to talk about was wanting to stay still when things around you are forcing you to move. This has actually happened to me multiple times in my life, not just back when I was in academia. I often find myself just wanting to stay still and just settle in, just do the work in front of me and just let myself develop at my own pace. However, the academic system and many other workplaces don't always allow you to do that. Back then and since then, I feel like it's generally not an acceptable position to take. I've been too afraid to express that a lot of times in my life because I guess I'm just afraid that wanting to stay still would be misinterpreted as a lack of ambition. Part of this might be my own insecurity, but I think it's actually a very real, legitimate fear. For example, I had my boss telling me that I needed to keep moving forward. He would always say, in academia, it's up or out. So for me, there's often this internal conflict between what I truly want and what the work environment around me actually expects of me. There have been a few moments in my life where I can feel myself not really living authentically according to my values. Sometimes it's like I'm on autopilot and I'll just go along with things and behave in a way that I think the world around me wants me to behave. But I'll have this strong gut feeling inside me telling me this is wrong. And I mean, like inside on a deep, very visceral level, I know that how I'm behaving and what I'm doing isn't what I want. That's how I know that sometimes I'm not really living authentically. Now, one good thing about those moments is it actually makes it clear to you what your values are and what you regard as important. And that's not always obvious. Living inauthentically can often make it clearer to you what your values actually are. If you get this feeling in your gut, that's a much clearer signal that you're doing something wrong. And it may be difficult to notice that signal if everything is okay all the time. It's often easier for us to notice sort of danger signals rather than safety signals. In this journal entry, I actually wasn't entirely honest with my boss about wanting to just stay still and develop at my own pace. And I would leave those meetings with him saying, yeah, great, let's write that grant application, let's do it. But I knew deep down I was having real doubts about whether I even wanted to stay in academia, and that plays out in the rest of the journal entry. But obviously I could never say that. There wasn't an environment around me that allowed for that. In the journal entry, I wrote about staying abroad as a way of not committing to my long-term future. I'm not sure I wrote that very eloquently, to be honest, so I just wanted to clarify that a little bit. So living as an expat away from my family and my past has always felt a bit like I'm living in a bubble that's away and separate from reality. As a foreigner, you never really fit in with your new surroundings because, for me, I'm not from Germany. So I've ended up in a position where I'm kind of separate from my past and somewhat separate from my adopted country too. And that's what I mean by that sense of living in a bubble. It feels a bit like escaping reality because it's like I'm willfully ignoring the roles and responsibilities and the identity that I grew up with. It's like I'm choosing not to connect with my past while putting myself in a position where I'm just an outsider wherever I go. On the one hand, it does feel a little like I'm running away from my past. Like I'm choosing not to be part of my family and all the roles and responsibilities I had in my past life and choosing not to live up to those responsibilities that come with that. On the other hand, living abroad has been like moving forward to something that felt more comfortable and more exciting for me. Now, I've lived abroad for 14 years now, and while I love the UK and actually prefer it to Germany in a lot of ways, to be perfectly honest, there is this sense of freedom and independence that I feel when I'm living separately from my past. It's hard to explain, but it just gives me a sense of comfort. I feel less constrained somehow, like I can be myself more. In the journal entry, I came to the conclusion that staying in Frankfurt was actually my best option. And with hindsight, I can say it definitely was. I ended up living in Frankfurt for 11 years in the end. So I guess that's one way where I did actually actively choose to live authentically according to what I valued and what I actually really wanted. I actually wrote in the journal entry that the prospect of staying in Frankfurt was actually the only option that didn't make me feel uncomfortable or stressed. So that's the gut feeling that I was talking about earlier. The opposite of that is if I make inauthentic choices, I end up getting this very uncomfortable feeling in my body. So it's very important to listen to those physical signals. This was the first time that I realized that I didn't really have any original research ideas of my own. This was quite an important stepping stone for me in my pathway out of academia. Like I said, I had assumed that eventually my own research ideas would naturally emerge over time. But for whatever reason, it just didn't happen. I think I was quite embarrassed and quite ashamed about this for quite a long time. This is one of the things that in the years after I left academia contributed to that sense that I kind of failed. I failed at academia because I wasn't as innovative as I needed to be. So it felt like a real weakness, especially at that moment in time where I really needed to be innovative and come up with research ideas for writing grant applications. I can remember actually sharing this point with some friends outside of academia at the time, and they would look at me and be like, "What? But Simit, you're a really creative person. You've done a lot of creative stuff. You do music, you do improv, you do whatever. How can you not come up with your own research ideas?" And this is actually how I was judging myself too. I'd always prided myself on being somewhat creative. I've always had some kind of artistic project on the side, music, songwriting, improv, whatever. So creativity was a big part of my identity. But for some reason, I just couldn't translate that to scientific research. And with hindsight and knowing everything I achieved in science since then, I still don't really understand why I was not really able to come up with my own research ideas. One lesson I have learned again and again in my career is that a weakness in one context can actually be a strength in another context. For example, in that journal entry, I correctly highlighted that my lack of innovation and my ability to go along with other people's ideas was actually a strength in the early part of my science career. It allowed me to basically work on anything. And since leaving academia, I've actually used my ability to adapt to other people's ideas to my advantage. In fact, when you actually work for a company outside of academia, this is a huge advantage because it's your job to push the company's agenda forward, not your own agenda. So I guess it doesn't really matter why I, for some reason, wasn't able to bring my creativity to my research career. It was important for me to recognize, though, that I just didn't have that innovation that I needed to progress much further. And it is easy to see that as a weakness or perhaps a failure, but every weakness that you have is just a quality of yours that can be a strength in another context. I really wish at this point in my career, into the third year of my postdoc, that I could have just been honest with my boss about all of these doubts. And I wish I could have spent the next 6 months of my postdoc preparing to leave academia, with help from my boss and with help and support from the research institute that I worked at. I wish I had the environment around me to make me feel safe enough to be honest about the fact that I just didn't really see myself continuing in academia. I wish there was a culture of supporting the development of hard technical skills and the softer skills that you might need to be transferred to jobs outside of academia. I wish someone, probably my boss, would have just said to me, if you don't want to stay in academia, that's fine. You can spend the next 6 months just developing the hard technical skills that you need for life outside academia, while at the same time continuing to contribute to the research of the group, but without wasting any time on the things that you probably don't need, like research grants. In the end, that's kind of what ended up happening. That's how I did end up spending my time. I was developing hard skills that were directly useful for outside of academia, but I was also wasting a lot of time on things that I never really needed. Like I wrote sort of part of a grant application and parts of papers that I never even submitted in the end. Sadly, I don't think this was ever really a realistic option for me. And I think it's very rare that this will ever happen in an academic environment. For a start, most academic mentors don't actually know what skills you need outside of academia. They are the academic system. They have probably spent their whole adult life in academia. So they have no idea what it's like to work outside of academia in a company or anything like that. So they can't really provide the guidance, even if they wanted to. They just don't have the experience. And in most cases, I'm not even sure they would want to. They have their own vested interests in furthering their own academic careers. So your research output as a postdoc is their research output. Your grant money that you bring in is their grant money that they bring in. So no academic mentor or academic institute is going to want to invest in you if there isn't an academic benefit for them. So given that most postdocs and PhD students will actually end up not staying in academia, I think the working culture in academia needs to be a bit more open to normalizing and supporting people who want to leave. The problem is, it's not really in their own vested interest to do so. So I'm honestly not that hopeful that this is ever going to change in academia. Perhaps there should be more incentives for academic institutions to facilitate people leaving. Maybe companies should pay the universities for promising candidates who want to leave academia and come and work for those companies, or maybe there should be some tax benefits. I don't know. I'm not a policy expert. Now, lots of universities and places do have careers departments and knowledge transfer programs and things like that. But it's not just about having those resources available to PhD students and postdocs. It's about the culture. Even if those resources were available to me, I would have felt so embarrassed going to those resources, because if my boss had found out that I wasn't so motivated to stay in academia, I was too afraid that it would hurt my chances of getting another extension to my contract. And that's the thing, I was always motivated to do the work and do the science, but I knew in my gut that my long-term future just wasn't in academia. So there you have it. I have been thinking a lot recently about intuition and gut feelings and the role that that's played in big decisions in my life. Back then, I obviously had quite a lot of feelings going on in my gut, but I had no idea what to do with them. One thing I have learnt is that it's not always easy, but following your gut feelings is often the path to having fewer regrets in the long run. In the next episode, we jump to July 2014, about 1 month later. I continue to explore this theme of your gut telling you to do one thing, but the world around you pushing you to do something else. And I have some revelations following the annual Barn Seminar. What the heck is a Barn Seminar? Join me next time to find out. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope that was valuable for you in some small way. Until next time, please be kind to yourself.
Brood about it, brood until the day, one day I will find the words to say.
Thanks again for listening to A Postdoc's Journal. I've been your host, Simit Patel. If you've enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others who you think might find it helpful and interesting. You could also leave a review over at Podchaser or on Apple Podcasts. If you can relate to anything in this episode, or if you have your own take on that journal entry, I would love to hear from you. Please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, Instagram, Blue Sky, or Reddit. Links to all my social media are in the show notes. Thanks again.